Hey folks, I'm JC from One Shot Adventures, and if you've watched this channel before, you know that I'm a fan of writing and running one-shot RPG adventures. But little known fact, I also love to run some bigger campaigns. I've had a blast over the years playing games like Call of Cthulhu's Mountains of Madness, or Pendragon's Great Pendragon campaign, and Warhammer's Enemy Within campaign, one that has been constantly reprinted through the years and runs across 5 different adventures. Well, I already did a video on how to best run part 1 of the Enemy Within campaign, Enemy in Shadows, and now this video is going to give you some tips and tricks on how to run part 2, Death on the Reik. Set in Warhammer's gritty old world, Death on the Reik is an open-ended adventure that sends the PCs up and down a bustling river on a dramatic hunt for a dangerous sorceress. And much like the first adventure, this one's chock full of evil cultists, mysteries, mutants, and rich old world history. But compared to part 1, Death on the Reik is an adventure that has a much bigger scale, taking place in the many towns and ports along the River Reik with a hugely expanded cast of characters. I've run Death on the Reik a few times over the years, and I've even used it in different game systems. I first ran it using its own Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, but also in OSR and GURPS. It's actually really easy to port to whatever system you like, as long as that system is gritty and death is just around the corner. As much as I love Death on the Reik and running it, I'll admit that it's not the easiest adventure to run. It's expansive, it doesn't provide the PCs with the strongest motivations, and it doesn't clearly sum up the many ways that the adventure can be run. So I'm here to help. Now, I won't do a full review of Death on the Reik, but I will give a quick summary of the adventure and then leap into my best tips on how to run this epic river adventure like a pro. However, beware, there are some serious spoilers ahead. So if you're wanting to play in this adventure, just stop watching the video now, spin your boat wheel right around, and head back to Bogenhofen. Here we go. Death on the Reik picks up right after Enemy in Shadows leaves off. The PCs are escaping the town of Bogenhofen. That's because either the town is overrun by demons because they fouled up the ending of Enemy in Shadows, or because whatever happened when they stopped the incursion, enough influential Bogenhofen merchants died in the aftermath, and the PCs are not exactly wanted in town anymore. So the PCs are heading back up the River Reik to get out of Dodge. And in theory, the PCs have evidence that a senior cultist, Etelka Herzen, who resides in the river town of Grissenwald, was somewhat responsible for the crazy Bogenhofen incident. So they're invested in tracking her down and stopping her. I'll talk more about that motivation in a bit, but let's keep going. As the PCs head towards Grissenwald, they'll have various encounters with cultists and mutants and other fun, small events. But the adventure really picks up when the PCs find a dwarven signal tower under construction along the river, and many of its workers have disappeared into the night. The signal tower turns out to be an old tower once held by a long-dead wizard, Dagmar Wittgenstein, who was on the trail of a massive piece of warpstone. Think of that as like a fantasy nuclear bomb, which will play into the events later in the adventure. The PCs eventually arrive in Grissenwald looking for Etelka, where they find that she owned a mine and a residence, but she left and both have been overrun by her goblin servants, who are now harassing the town, like goblins like to do. Once the PCs kill her goblins, they'll discover that Etelka headed into the desolate barren hills, a wasteland where she's on the hunt for some sort of great weapon of some sort. Well, that's the warpstone, though the PCs may not make that connection yet. In the Barren Hills, a ghost tells them all about Dagmar's original expedition to discover and reclaim the warpstone, and the PCs now have to deal with a band of Skaven rat men who are obsessed with warpstone. Eventually, the PCs will confront Atelka and learn that the warpstone she's looking for is actually in the basement of Castle Wittgenstein, which is where Dagmar Wittgenstein used to live. Castle Wittgenstein is a cursed castle filled with crazy nobles, mutants, undead, and so much more. And now the PCs have to break into the castle and either steal or destroy the warpstone before the Skaven get there. And 9 times out of 10, the PCs end up blowing up the castle in that process, which makes for a really fun conclusion to this adventure.
Good job, my friends. Skaven defeated. The warpstone is ours. I just want to jam my sword into it to see what happens.
Now, I just described Death on the Reich fairly linearly, but the reality is that this adventure can be much more open-ended. In fact, I think that there's 3 ways to run Death on the Reich. It can either be a complete sandbox, with the PCs acting as merchant adventurers going up and down the river, selling goods, making deals, and building wealth, and kind of leisurely discovering the clues to the larger story. It can also be a very linear adventure, where the PCs hit the key parts on the river in a very specific order. Or it can be a mix of the two, a sort of sandbox on a linear river where the players can experience the main events of the story in very different orders that I described and fit in some subplots and side quests along the way. This is actually the way I prefer to run the adventure. Now, as a GM, you should consider what your players enjoy and how long you want this adventure to run. While I've never run this adventure as a full sandbox, I've read stories of it taking dozens and dozens of sessions for players to finish it. As a more linear adventure, it can probably be completed in about 5 or 6 sessions. So figure out how you want to run it before you set out doing so. But no matter how you run Death on the Reich, I'm going to give you my 5 best tips on how to master this adventure and run it as smoothly as you possibly can. Tip number 1, improve the motivations. Okay, so motivation is the biggest issue in this adventure, and if you watch any of my tips, watch this one. Even if the players played Enemy in Shadows and have great memories of all of its events, there's a very good chance that they'll have no clue who Atelka Herzen is. And that's a problem because not only is she the main villain of this adventure, the whole adventure is hinged on the fact that the players want to chase after her and hunt her down. But even though it's critical that the PCs are motivated to find Atelka, the adventure really doesn't make that clear. Her only mention in the previous adventure, Enemy in Shadows, was one little clue on a letter, which the PCs may not have even found. I mean, literally, her name is mentioned once on a letter with a return address, and that's the motivation for this adventure if you play it as written.
Look, my friends, I found a clue. It's on handout 14, which we found in the bottom of that drawer in that optional part of the mansion we visited. Well, if you take a look at the proper name at the bottom, match it on the other side to the return address, well, we have weeks of adventure in front of us. Tally-ho!
In my Enemy in Shadows tips, I told you to play up Atelka more in that adventure so you'll have less of a problem in Death on the Reich. But maybe you missed that video and now you're trying to run Death on the Reich without having known that. That's okay, there's so many ways to fix this. First, hidden in the back of the book, they mention that there's a wizard who can randomly tell the PCs all about Atelka and send the PCs after her. But I kind of find that clunky. It's a leftover from the original 1987 version where the PCs were all pre-generated characters and one of them had a wizard master they needed to meet with. But there's better ways to do this. Here's how I fix the issue and really motivate the players from the very first session. One of the first NPCs that the players get to interact with in Death on the Reich is Elvira. She was an herbalist at the Schaffenfest festival in the last adventure, and for some strange reason, Death on the Reich thinks the PCs will naturally want to go visit her in the town of Weisbruck, which is one of the first towns they can arrive in along the River Reik. And there, Elvira ends up getting kidnapped. Now, as presented, this side quest is completely irrelevant to the rest of the adventure, but you can use it to set up the whole motivation for Death on the Reich. First, start with Elvira on the player's boat as they leave Bogenhofen. She's also in a hurry to leave the town too. She shares that after the events in Bogenhofen, no matter how that adventure ended, she thinks that the nefarious Red Crown cult is definitely involved. And as an herbalist with a checkered past, she used to do business with the Red Crown and she fears them. I like to add that after the end of the last adventure, Johannes Teugen's servants, he was the main bad guy in the last adventure, they were all interrogated by the authorities. And Elvira, who has her ears to the walls, found out that it was clear that the Red Crown had shipped Johannes Teugen his evil magical scrolls and supplies that he used in that adventure. And through the interrogation, the names Ernst Heidelmann came out as the deliverer of those supplies, and that his master was a Thalco Herzen, who was mentioned in some of the correspondence that Teugen had had. And have Elvira really play up that the Red Crown is in league with chaos, and that if Thalco and Heidelmann were sending these scrolls to Bogenhofen, they were probably sending them to other places too. So now, if the PCs are motivated by banishing evil, if they're those types of players, they'll be interested in tracking down Thalco and Heidelmann. Or perhaps there's a big reward on their heads because they were definitely involved in that chaos conspiracy in the last adventure. So now, when the players arrive in Weisbruck to drop Elvira off, she says that they need to talk to a wizard who lives in Altdorf, like the next big town up. His name is Hieronymus Blitzen, and he's an expert in the Red Crown. He's been studying them for years. But she doesn't remember his address. After all, Altdorf is a huge, monstrous city, so she says drop by her herbalist shop in the morning, and she'll look it up and she'll give them his address. And of course, when the players arrive at her shop in the morning, Elvira has been kidnapped and taken to the Red Barn, which is described in this adventure. And now you make those kidnappers members of the Red Crown. They were sent by Albrecht Holzauber, a senior cultist who wanted revenge on Elvira after she sold him fake pharmaceuticals. And now the kidnapping and the rescue of Elvira plays out exactly like it does in the first part of this adventure as described in the book. If you take this approach, in the very first session of this adventure, the players will have very clear motivation, they will have way more insight into what's going on, and they have actually 2 missions in Altdorf they can think about. They can go visit Elvira's contact, Hieronymus Blitzen, who will tell them more about Thalco and that she's bad news and how she was once a noble, but her family was betrayed by the emperor. And now he's heard through the grapevine in his contacts that she and Ernst Heidelmann, her apprentice, are on a quest to assemble some kind of horrible curse to destroy key noble houses throughout the empire. And that Bogenhofen was just an early start and a distraction for her bigger plan. Or the PCs can track down that Albrecht Holzauber, the man who arranged for the kidnapping Elvira, who will also tell them that they're screwed and that Thalco's already planning horrible things to bring around the destruction of the empire, and in a month the whole world will end. He can be very dramatic and the PCs can kill him off and that's fine, but the point is he's there to explain more about the doom of the empire as brought about by Thalco. Either way, you've now set up Thalco as a big bad guy, given her a backstory and clear objective, destroy key factions within the empire, and give tracking her down some urgency because the players now know that she's working on some evil grand plot to destroy the empire and that she's within a month or so of completing it. And once you do this, telling everybody about Thalco early on in this adventure, she becomes the centerpiece of this adventure, which is exactly what she should be. Number 2, add flair to the battles. There's a lot of fighting in Death on the Reik, but until you get to Castle Wittgenstein, all of the combats are fairly generic, like goblins in the mines, zombies in a tower, etc. This probably felt okay back in 1987 when this adventure was originally written, but by today's standards, these battles can be a little bit boring and samey for the players. And I've also found they can be too easy for the players, especially if they've survived the previous adventure. So I add an extra element to virtually all the encounters to make each battle more memorable. So for example, I like to add hopping squigs or snotlings or flail-wielding fanatics to the goblin encounters. I make one of the zombies in the tower a grave guard who's like armored and virtually unstoppable. I add a globadier with the Skaven encounters who chucks poison gas grenades at the PCs. Hey look! That Skaven has a snow globe! Ooh, scary! Etelka also needs some beefing up here, since if you run that final confrontation with her and her apprentice right out of the book, I find that they can go down really fast and that battle is anticlimactic. So what I do is I reveal to the players very early on that the Red Crown always travels in threes, kind of like a terrorist cell rule. So the players will always know about Etelka and Ernst Heidelman, her apprentice, but they'll wonder who the third one is. And then this, as a GM, is where you get to have fun and you can strengthen her with a new ally of your choosing. I like to make the third a beastman, like Ungor war chief, who has a pack of his beastman allies kind of skulking behind the main group, and he's got a horn that he can instantly like call them to his aid. And if you add a third warrior type into that final battle with Etelka and Ernst, along with some beastman bodyguards, well, now that battle gets really dangerous and much more interesting than the one described in the book. Tip number 3, differentiate the towns. It's an understatement to say that there are a lot of town visits in Death on the Reich, from the corrupt capital city of Altdorf and the serene forested Unterbaum and the cliffs of Kemperbad and the horrific desperation of the Wittgendorf village. There's just a lot of stops on the river. That was just a few of them that I mentioned. So as a GM, you really need to differentiate these towns to your players. Otherwise, they'll all feel the same and your players will start to get confused because they'll all sort of merge in their heads as they're playing. And it also, if you don't do a good job of describing these towns, you'll also lose a lot of the fun feel of the Warhammer world because these towns are actually pretty different and interesting as described in the book. And even though I've run this adventure several times, I've continued to make the mistake of not being familiar with the towns when the players arrive, because it does have a little bit of an open-ended aspect to this adventure. Your players can end up in a town that maybe you weren't quite prepared for. So before you run this adventure, take time to write an index card with a short description of each town, key sites or monuments, and maybe one or two famous people there, maybe a trade good that the town is known for if your players are excited to be merchants. Think about how the people talk and think about the world that they live in. Maybe Altdorfers are kind of fast-talking city folk, while the Unterbaum people are arrogant and anxious, like fearing for their lives because they're on the verge of a civil war with the dwarves, so they're very standoffish and paranoid. Just spend some extra time prepping your towns like you would NPCs in any other adventure, and Death on the Reich will be that much more memorable to your players. Tip number 4, plan ahead for Castle Wittgenstein. After the players have defeated Etelka, the adventure will conclude inside the huge Gothic walls of Castle Wittgenstein, which is where the Warpstone is being held. Cursed for generations, this castle is home of corruption, monsters, and the arrogant Lady Marguerite who runs the whole place with an iron grip. The castle is a really amazing and memorable set piece, and it's filled with so many cool encounters inside of it. However, just like the adventure itself, you can run Castle Wittgenstein in many different ways. You can run it like a giant dungeon crawl, which can take many sessions with the PCs going from room to room, killing enemies and avoiding traps. Running Wittgenstein as a full-on dungeon crawl can take many sessions, and you're going to need a constant source of healing or else the players will get ground down to nothingness. Or you can use the castle as a sort of special ops mission, with the players sneaking in to find the Warpstone, avoiding the bad guys, and getting right to the conclusion with the battle with the Skaven over the Warpstone. In this case, make sure you make it easy for the players to sneak in. Maybe the rebels who live in the woods outside the castle know a secret way into the dungeon and are willing to launch an assault on the castle to distract the guards while the players sneak in. Last time I played this, my players came up with a great plan. They purposely got captured by Lady Marguerite just to wind up inside the dungeon. And that was a fun conclusion, even though they skipped about 2/3 of the castle itself. Although sadly that means they missed my favorite part of the castle, where the players meet Ludwig von Wittgenstein, a human cockroach hybrid who loves literature and playing piano. I've also seen that other fans have made smaller, more constrained maps of Castle Wittgenstein that shrink it to a more manageable size in case you don't want that section to be overly long. My point here is that you should know what your players like and customize it appropriately, just so this castle doesn't turn into a slog that kills the momentum and maybe many players before you've built up that conclusion where the warp stone must be seized inside the basement. Also, the adventure has this Deus Ex Diabolo in the final encounter, so that whatever happens, the Skavens swoop in to steal the warp stone or use it to blow up the castle. Yes, do this if it makes sense, but the warp stone doesn't really play a part in any of the other Enemy Within adventures, so you can actually let the PCs win the day and escape with it just fine. Just warn your players that Warpstone will irradiate them and mutate them very, very fast, so they'll probably get rid of it, or maybe return it to the Empire in exchange for reputation and status, which will actually help kick off the next adventure, Power Behind the Throne. Tip number 5, don't stress about leaving things out. There is so much in this adventure, and it's hard to tell what's required and what's optional, and I didn't even go into the whole book, the companion that adds tons of extra side quests and rules and stuff like that. But as long as your PCs are properly motivated, this adventure is remarkably resilient. It's really hard to wreck it, so don't worry if your players miss something or do something out of order, or if you just want to cut out a section that you don't find interesting, just do it. Every single time I've run this adventure, it's played out remarkably different, and it all works. Really, there's just 4 parts of the adventure that have to happen: the Dwarven Signal Tower, Etelka's residence in Grissenwald, the Ghost in the Barren Hills, and the final Wittgenstein finale. Everything else just adds texture, flavor, and lots of fun moments and encounters and opportunities for role-playing. And if you do want to run this adventure as a shorter, more contained affair, well then you just make one session about each of those 4 parts and it works. As a great example of just how resilient this adventure really is, the last time I ran this, the players got to the Dwarven Signal Tower and they discovered after defeating the zombies that they were missing the final key that they needed to reveal what was underneath the tower, Dagmar's hidden library, which tells all about the warp stone. Now the adventure expects the PCs to find this key like weeks and weeks later in the Barren Hills and return to the Signal Tower. However, since I was using GURPS, one of my players had picked up enough earth magic that he came up with a very clever plan of replicating one of those keys like exactly.
Oh, did you say we're missing a key to a major plot point? Oh, no problem. Oh, and that's why you bring a wizard.
He made a copy of the missing key, and I was like, uh-oh, but I let them waltz right into Dagmar's library so many sessions before they were supposed to, but it didn't derail the adventure at all. In fact, it got them more excited about the mystery of the warp stone and motivated them even more to chase down Etelka, and they even wondered if there was a lich of Dagmar, a Wittgenstein around somewhere. So moral of the story is, don't be afraid to give your players plenty of agency in this adventure. It's all still gonna work. Well, those are my 5 best tips on how to run Death on the Reik. You can also search the internet. There's some amazing guides out there from veteran GMs who've run this one, and I encourage that you do so. But if you've run this adventure or played in it, give me your best tips. Like, I'm positive that there's tons of great stories about how players have adventured along this river. Like, let me know in the comments below. If you found this video helpful and want to see more videos like this, go ahead and like and subscribe to this channel. It's been a while since I've played Power Behind the Throne, the next adventure in this series, but I will do a video on that soon. Until next time, I'm JC, and just remember, if you ever need to spice up combat in the old world, just add squigs. They never disappoint.